All right, let's go ahead and kick off. We are going to start diving in and talking about the approval assistant, specifically some important notes, some best practices, particularly for Missouri, which is where we're aiming the current rollout. But this recording, this seminar is really applicable to everyone who's going to be using the approval assistant. Finally, some troubleshooting tips. If you haven't already watched the introduction to the approval assistant, this seminar might be a little bit confusing. It doesn't mean you can't watch it, but you'll probably be benefited by watching the actual approval assistant training video first. So just a heads up, that is probably going to be the less confusing order. All right, so with that, let's just go ahead and dive into stuff and start out with some important notes. Okay, so the approval assistant has an aim. It is really aimed at unbilled, unapproved visits, so visits that need action. It's also primarily, though not completely, aimed at Medicaid visits. It was really built as a way of making the challenges of reason coding for the state a lot easier. That doesn't mean it can't be used for other things, but it's what it was really aimed at. Again, visits that require coding, that's where it's really meant to make things easier because it will resolve those red warnings as the codes are applied. Customers with 100 plus visits in the needs action category weekly, this is especially going to be helpful for you. This is going to make your life a lot easier because let's face it, the visit approval dashboard is slower, and the larger your company is, the more time gets eaten up there. So the approval assistant can be used with non-Medicaid visits for cleaning and visit management. It just wasn't designed for those visit types. If you have watched the approval assistant video, this section here, you can see that it's not colored the way it is here, but it does have these four sections. And I've tried to clarify, this is also available on our help site. You know, the data entry section, it's going to let you know if you've missed data. Reason codes, it's going to let you know if you missed your reason codes. You have the opportunity to adjust duration or look at them more closely, and the option to approve visits that no longer have red warnings once you've gone through these first stages. So let's talk about some best practices. Preparation and consistency. So filling out all the necessary fields prior to scheduling visits for clients or caregivers. We all know this is going to make your life easier. Being thorough the first time, measure twice, cut once. In addition, regularly work through the visit approval dashboard so issues do not pile up. I am actually working with several customers who did not work through their visits on a regular basis, and they're feeling kind of overwhelmed. And I don't want any of our customers to hit that point. Doesn't mean we won't help you if you do reach that point, but it just makes your life a lot easier if you don't get there. Let's talk about some other general best practices. One is to work one category at a time. This category concept is just really helpful because you might end up doing things to visits that don't need it. Um, it is not the end of the world if you end up coding visits that don't need it, because coding data is generally not delivered unless you are sending a visit into an aggregator, whether that's SendData or HHA Exchange or NetSmart or any other number of aggregators. But it might be confusing, among other things, and it leaves you with some unclear records. So in general, filter for your Medicaid. Think about applying the appropriate actions to that when you are doing the coding section. Obviously, for the data entry section, that first section, that applies to everything because probably you want to check and make sure you've got data regardless of whether someone is VA or long-term care insurance or anything like that. So that's going to be some useful stuff. Another best practice. Using the approval assistant to prevent rejections rather than fix rejections. Again, starting in needs action. That doesn't mean that you can't fix visits that are rejected using the approval assistant. A lot of times things come back rejected and you say, oh, man, I forgot to code that batch. And you can use the approval assistant to fix it, but it's just going to make your life a little bit easier to fix it before delivering. You want to get used to that process because it's also just going to make your data look better. You want to be on the ball, not getting those rejections, paying attention to that. If you do use the approval assistant for rejected visits, you need to think about your filters because obviously needs action, that's not going to be your rejected visits. Needs action is for unapproved visits that need action. So if you're going to rejected visits, make sure your review status is all, make sure your export status is rejected, and probably pick a reasonable time frame. Technically, you can use the approval assistant now up to 10,000 visits. During our pilot program, we went and started out from a very low, under 1,000 number and dramatically increased it. But realistically, it takes a long time, the higher the number is, and it might time out on you. I'd say the sweet spot is probably working in batches of 2 or 3,000. That is what I have found to be helpful. Even for our very large customers, they usually can work in batches of 2 or 3,000. But yes, returning to the question of rejected visits, filter for just the appropriate categories to make sure you're actually seeing those rejected visits. Because if you filter for rejected and needs action, nothing's going to come up. All right. We are also going to work top to bottom. That's your best practice. It's more than just a practice. It's really honestly necessary. And here's why. This last section, approve visits, it is only going to approve visits if they don't have any red warnings left. So these first two sections in particular are going to help you resolve those red warnings. The first section, again, data entry, it's going to tell you what you forgot. You fix those, you run rules, those red warnings will disappear. The reason code section, it's going to resolve those warnings that we give you. Quick side note, a conversation that I feel like I have frequently is, well, there's a red warning on it, so Sandata must be mad about it, or Authenticare, or whichever aggregator we're talking about. Please keep in mind that the items in the reason code section, we're typically going to highlight things the aggregator is going to flag and that require coding. There are plenty of warnings that are not specifically intended for the aggregator. They're rules that you set up to be able to keep an eye on things. They don't care if you go long. You probably do care. They're not going to tell you certain things are an issue, but you know that ultimately they are issues because you might not be able to bill without them. So keep that in mind. Work top to bottom so that you have the most number of resolved items as possible so you can improve as much as possible. Next is give each section time to process. Sometimes we will see folks who are excited and they are going ahead and just jumping from one thing to another. And you want to make sure that everyone is actually processing first before you move on to the next section, particularly before you move to the last section. Because the first section takes the longest, there's actually now a progress bar to help you understand that it's still working, particularly if you use if you're doing a large number of them, we're processing a large number of visits. So yes, manage your visits and then approve. Okay, troubleshooting. Let's talk about some key troubleshooting practices. Data entry. Run rules didn't work. This came up a lot during the pilot program. One of the most common issues, people not clicking save after fixing the errors. They may click on the client's name, pop them open in a new tab, add in a Medicaid ID, but if you don't click save, you haven't fixed the issue. So please remember to click save. I know it sounds really silly, but this came up a lot. You might not have waited long enough. Maybe you entered all of those corrections, you clicked run rules, you haven't waited long enough. It's a lot harder to make this mistake now that we have a progress bar, but just, respect the progress bar. Make sure you're giving it a minute. Um, and finally, you may have selected too many visits. That's a lot harder to do now with such a high limit, but it has happened. I've seen customers go ahead and select from, November 8th, 2021 in Missouri through today, and they're trying to run through tons and tons of visits, and that's not going to work. So be aware, it's a high limit, but there is a limit. Okay, so let's talk about the life cycle real quick, particularly of clients and caregivers, because this is another one where people have struggled, and we want to make sure that this process is clear. So if you see a client or caregiver issue, start by fixing the issue. You're going to filter for those rejections, you're going to see the errors, and you're going to fix those clients or caregivers. If you take away nothing else from today's seminar, I really want you to remember that fixing the client or caregiver data entry issue is actually only the first step. Fixing that is just the beginning because you now have the correct information, but you've got to deliver that to the state's library, to their aggregator. So fix the issue, then re-export the clients and or caregivers, and finally, resend their visits. So fix, export the profiles, export the visits, and then you're going to wait. It is often faster than 24 hours, but I do recommend you wait 24 hours before you worry, just because sometimes they run slow, sometimes they run fast. It just depends on how much data is headed their way. And as new customers come online and get caught up, they may send a huge amount, can slow the pipeline down. So just be aware, give it a little time and then check for your responses. I know that everyone wants us to automate this process. You are not alone. I want to as well, but it is a highly complex one that would take up a lot of space. So it's not going to be happening tomorrow. So this is an important life cycle to understand. By the way, thank you again for holding your questions until the end. When we do get to that point, I welcome your questions. We're almost there. And this is something that I'm particularly welcome questions because it's really important. And I know it's thrown some folks. All right, so troubleshooting. Um, One issue we see is people saying, oh my goodness, there is nothing here to go ahead and approve. And one of the challenges may be just that you have left exclude approved visits. If you've already approved things, we're just going to assume you've made your best choices. But sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes customers have pulled up the approval assistant to check their work. As you can see in this little recording, when you unchecked the visit and said, yeah, I want to see even the approved visits, you can see that someone went and approved the visits, but they forgot some important codes. This can be particularly helpful if you have a new administrative staff member who may be struggling a little bit with their coding. You could go back and check their work this way and say, let's see if they actually went and they did these correctly. On the other hand, you may sometimes, well, most of the time want to leave this checked because maybe you've already processed those visits and you've applied appropriate codes, particularly if you had to use some unusual codes. Do I need to reason or action code? Um, You only need to code visits that have EVV issues, which are being delivered to your aggregator. So again, if it is a long-term care insurance, if it is private pay, if it is any of those things, you want to make sure that that data, you don't need to code it. You're just wasting your time. If you're not clear on which visits are required, we can send you a clarifying list. Now, keep in mind, visits that require coding, if they have EVV issues, they will be rejected if they're not coded. Most states are already rejecting billing for rejected visits. So in Missouri, there has been an unusual situation where they have allowed agencies to continue to bill through an EDI file, and yet they have to send in their data to SANData. Missouri is going to move soon to SANData-based billing, so your future billing will depend on visits with issues being coded and accepted. The visit has to have state acceptance to be billable, and in most states, that's already the case if you're sending data to an aggregator. Okay, so my visits won't approve. The approval assistant, it can't change duration on invoice visits. You may have selected too many visits. And the approval assistant, of course, again, will not approve visits that still have unresolved red warnings. And this is in your interest. Another conversation that I have repeatedly is, well, why didn't the approval assistant solve everything? It's not going to. It's not really intended to. The approval assistant is intended to take down your number of visits that need your attention from 100% down to 10, 20%, where you can look at the ones that remain that have some unusual warnings, some situations that you need to look at that aren't the standard ones. So, don't expect 100%. Resolve everything with the approval assistant and then take a look at what remains and think about what challenges those are providing and how you can solve those. So again, invoiced visits, you can't change the duration. That would cause a mismatch between how you're billing the state and your recorded invoice history. Could have selected too many visits. You could have unresolved warnings. It's not going to go ahead and approve those visits if you haven't resolved everything. So here's a big question. What visits can I change the duration on? The change duration section is powerful, and frankly, it can be misused. We have provided this with a little bit of trepidation. The best practice really is to change only the visit durations which were confirmed as late clockouts due to forgetting to clock out earlier. What this means is you really need to communicate with your caregivers. A lot of agencies use note requirements. In this section, you can click on this 13 visits in this case, and it would open it in a new tab. And you could go ahead and you could look at those visits individually. And you could say, oh yeah, Jane, Joe, and George, they all left me notes about why they went long. I'm approving those and they'll be excluded. Note the exclude approved visits. But all these other ones, there was no explanation. And we have a standing rule, whatever the case may be, your company policy, you may go ahead and change those back to the appropriate list if no note was given. This is particularly applicable for private pay, that kind of situation, or situations with clear contracts. Again, don't get yourself in trouble. Best practice is to only change the visit durations which were confirmed as late clockouts. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Check those notes and think about whether this section is really appropriate to your visits. In our recent conversations with Missouri, we were told that once billing goes through SANData, visits will be billed by actual or corrected times. Now, this is a little complicated, so bear with me. It's important. This means that the don't bill more than X rules, where we provide billable units to the state, that will no longer work once you bill through SANData. So it's actual or corrected times that will be used to bill. So that's how you're going to have to work with things. You can't just depend on, oh, well, Encoda doesn't let me bill longer, because that's not how it's going to work anymore. Remember, correcting visit times and dates also makes them manual, and the state does not want manual visits. I mean, no state wants that. Every state is aiming to meet the 21st Century Cures Act and to have accurate EVV. That is a huge push. So you want to correct as little as possible. Too many manual visits can be a problem, in short. So what does this mean? You need to encourage your caregivers to clock out on time so you don't have to make so many changes. Encoda provides clock out text message reminders. Make sure you're using them. Watch your caregivers' habits. Address repeated issues. Let them know you are watching. Use the titration board to reschedule future visit links. If the authorization is being used up too quickly and the work is verified, if it's acceptable for them to go long, if, for example, the authorization is 40 hours a week, but they ended up doing 12 hours on Monday and 12 hours on Tuesday, you can shorten those visits later in the week and talk to the caregiver and say, look, you're only authorized for so much. I'm shortening your scheduled visits later this week. This is an opportunity to use your encoded tools and to communicate with your caregiver to stay within the authorization. So people only work the appropriate amount of time and that you can bill the appropriate amount of time. Use Encoda warnings or reports. Filter the visit approval dashboard duration column to see when visits are significantly over duration. Pay attention, in short. This is a really important thing. Okay, so we've covered the most common issues. We are going to cover questions. I am going to go ahead and stop the recording at this time.